Can I welcome everyone to the 14th meeting of the Education and Skills Committee, and can I please remind everyone present to turn their mobile phones and other devices onto silent for the duration of the meeting. The second item of business is a session on the Enterprise and Skills Review, and I welcome to the meeting Keith Brown, Cabinet Secretary for the Economy, Jobs and Fair Work, Hugh McAloon, Head of Youth Employment, and Paul Smart, Head of Colleges, Young Workforce and SFC Sponsorship Division in the Scottish Government. I understand the Cabinet Secretary wishes to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. I will be brief. Just first of all to thank the committee for the invitation to come and speak here today on the Enterprise and Skills Review, and in particular the impact of that review on the two agencies involved, SDS and the Scottish Funding Council. As you'll know, the First Minister announced the review on the 25th of May and that it would cover the work of the Scottish Government and four of its agencies, Scottish Enterprise, including SDI, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, SDS and SFC. The Phase 1 decisions of the Enterprise and Skills Review were published by me on the 25th of October. The aim was to take fresh action towards our long-term ambition encapsulated in Scotland's economic strategy. That was to rank in the top quartile of OECD countries for productivity, equality, well-being and sustainability. And that ambition was the foundation for the work of our four enterprise and skills agencies, both individually and together with each other and the Scottish Government. We recognise the vital contribution the four agencies make to creating a more successful country with opportunities for all of Scotland to flourish through delivering inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Our agencies and their staff already carry out excellent work with a diverse range of partners around Scotland, and as Audit Scotland noted, they have been successful in their respective roles with clear strategies and good governance. The enterprise agencies, for example, collectively work with or assist around 11,200 businesses each year, and there are good examples of all of them working with partners to achieve a positive impact, such as creating jobs. While the review has been undertaken in the context, of course, of post-recession public sector expenditure, and we have all been looking closely at opportunities for savings and investment which will deliver the greatest return, the primary purpose of the review is about identifying ways in which we can strengthen the support on offer and the economic outcomes it delivers. That's why we aim to establish an overarching single board which will allow us to strategically position our agencies and effectively align the services they deliver. We are alert to the stakeholders' concerns about the process of closer alignment between the agencies and the creation of a single board, and in particular those concerns expressed by the university sector. So a key focus of Phase 2 of the review will be to work very closely with the public bodies and the stakeholders to ensure that the new structures enable a more integrated approach to enterprise and skill support, while maintaining distinctive approaches where appropriate. And I'd want to emphasise that the autonomy of universities will be protected, and that I do of course recognise the value of arm's-length bodies advising ministers about matters across both the F and HE sectors. We are alert to stakeholders' concerns about the process of closer alignment between the agencies and the creation of a single board, in particular those of the university sector. So we will work very closely with the bodies. They'll be integral to the next stage of the review, and I'd want to emphasise that the autonomy and the academic freedom of universities will be protected, and that we recognise the integrity of that currently, and that it will be protected as we go forward. So with those comments, Convener, I'm happy to try and answer any questions the committee may have.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. You ran the formal call for evidence between 15th of July and 15th of August. How confident is the Scottish Government that the views heard during that relatively short consultation period are representative of the various people and organisations with an interest in or are served by Enterprise and Skills Agency?
Well, we had a very substantial response, over 300 responses during the course of that period, 329 responses, and that was from a very broad spread of interested parties. And of course, the review itself is not finished yet. We have Phase 2 of that review, and the level of involvement is still very substantial across the sector and from stakeholders in the area. So, for example, what's different from Phase 1 is that the bodies themselves, the four agencies, will have representation on the Ministerial Review Group. We also have under active consideration the possibility of a transitional body which will include the agencies themselves for three different reasons. One, really to provide the reassurance to the agencies about the central nature of their involvement in the process going forward, and to reassure the staff that are there as well. Secondly, there'll be decisions that are required to be taken, of course, over the course of the remainder of the review. Those decisions properly rest with the agencies, but they will want to coordinate those where they can to achieve that alignment which I've previously mentioned, and also to provide support to the Ministerial Review Group in terms of the work that they'll be doing. There's a substantial number of work streams. So I think that level of stakeholder engagement is extensive, and it's involved those people with the greatest interest in relation to that. So we also have, as I say, a series, quite a large number of work streams going forward from the Ministerial Review Group, and it'll be open then to take on board other expertise as we go forward. So I think the engagement has been both widespread and substantial.
Thanks for that. In the consultation responses, there was talk of a cluttered landscape, difficult to access support, tension between national and regional approaches, and a lack of partnership working. Can you give us some details of the specific focus of activity and actions being pursued through the second phase of the review, which might help to deal with some of these issues?
Yeah, as I say, we have a number, quite a large number of areas that we're looking at. Perhaps the first and most important of those is the issue of governance. And I mentioned in my opening statement about the concerns that have been expressed in relation to the university sector in particular, also in relation to HIE. So a very substantial piece of work being done on governance as to how we make sure that we recognise the strengths and the requirements of those sectors in terms of the new governance structure which is built around the new overarching board. So that's one area. Another area which is interesting, I'm sure, to members is the idea of regionalisation. So COSLA have been involved in this Ministerial Review Group at a high level from the start, and have been very helpful, in fact, in recent weeks in saying that as we move forward into phase 2, they are willing to consider, or allowed to be considered, the current functions which they carry out in relation to business gateway and economic development to be considered alongside our ongoing work for, say, skills development, how that might be delivered on a regional basis around the country. So that may well result in much closer collaboration right the way through the different economic development functions and skills functions of different bodies, and of course may result in additional autonomy for bodies across Scotland and Highlands and islands in the south of Scotland as well. So you have the governance, you have regionalisation, you also have separate streams in relation to, I suppose, what's called decluttering. We're aware that there are a substantial number of initiatives and different bodies, so we've asked for work to be undertaken which recognises there's only so many people that can service all of those initiatives and those bodies, and if it's the case that we find that there are overlapping or any duplication, we should be looking to make sure that we can eradicate that to be more effective. So those are three that I can mention off the top of my head. I don't know if Paul or Hugh want to mention any of the other work streams which you have ongoing. Maybe not.
Yeah, there are several based on the decisions that came out of the first phase of the review. As the Cabinet Secretary has already mentioned, a stronger governance at the top there with an overarching strategic board. But in addition to that, a proper look at national and local enterprise skills delivery in a much more coordinated way. So facing up to the observation from a number of evidence givers that it was a cluttered landscape. I think it was as cluttered in terms of saying, well, how can they be better aligned to deliver their services? Looking at a better international coordination of activity to respond to the opportunities in international markets. Simplifying the innovation to support ecosystems, so looking at the whole way in which innovation is promoted by the range of agencies that are already engaged in that. Looking at aligning the functions of learning and skills agencies, principally Scottish Funding Council and Skills Development Scotland. Looking thoroughly at the learner journey, the 15 to 24-year-old journey through the education and skills development systems, and review, which is fundamental actually, review the effectiveness of investment in learning and skills as well, where I think there is a number of evidence given during the phase 1 that we needed to be much more effective at measuring the impact and outcomes of our interventions.
I think it's worth also mentioning, Convener, that digital is another work stream, but these work streams were just in the process of having had the first ministerial review group since the end of phase 1, so the start of phase 2, of writing out to members of the ministerial review group to see which areas they want to see taken forward and which they individually want to be involved in. So that's under active discussion. But digital is another area where we intend to see a very fundamental work stream as to how we move forward in that area as well.
Yeah, thank you. Joanne?
Thanks very much. I think already we've been able to see just how substantial and significant this work is. Massive, involves huge numbers of people in really important roles. I wonder what prompted you to have a review that only lasted a month during the summer holidays?
Well, the review lasted substantially longer than that. I think you're referring to the consultation period, but the review lasted longer than that. And what prompted us to do that, I think, as I said in my opening statement, that we have to recognise that the ambition that we had, and I think it was true of previous governments as well, to move Scotland from that third quartile in terms of economic performance, and that relates obviously to things like competitiveness, productivity, internationalisation. We hadn't achieved what we had sought to achieve, and if you're not achieving that, then it seems right and proper to me that we do, as the First Minister announced, review those agencies which are most central to that. So that was the prompt for it, but it was also the case that whether in the Parliament, in the Chamber or in its committees, there has been concern expressed over previous years about whether there's duplication. I think it's also true to say that we felt very strongly that the agencies themselves could very much justify the work they were doing, and they could point to the successes they'd had, sometimes very substantial successes. But it wasn't the case that we saw that alignment of the agencies across each other, so that you had, for example, in terms of international activity, that level of focus. So in previous years, I remember a minister going to China to promote both Scotland and the university sector with a Scottish university, and I think 2, maybe 3 other universities turned up on the day because they were worried about missing out. And I think whether it's that or whether it's in relation to some of the work we do through SDI, we've got some very substantial presences around the world with universities as well. I think we want to be selling Scotland as a whole, and we have to coordinate our activities more substantially. So that was the prompt for doing that. And of course, it's not the case the reviews lasted for a month. The review's still ongoing. We're still in the review with some months to go before it's concluded.
So the consultation lasted a month over the summer holidays.
Yeah, but I think you said the review lasted a month.
Well, I'm now saying the consultation lasted for a month over the summer holidays. Are there any other examples in your time in government where you've consulted over a month in the summer over something as substantial as this?
Well, given that I think most of my time in government I've had a particular focus, I can only talk about the areas that I've been involved in, so I couldn't answer the question about other consultations.
To find out if there are any examples of Scottish Government consultations that last a month over the summer. Can you ask if in any of the responses in the consultation did anybody suggest the need for an overarching board? And I'm not saying people didn't say there was a cluttered landscape, they didn't say there were problems. Which of the people who responded identified that as the solution?
Well, I could mention a number of individuals within the Ministerial Review Group who represent bodies that responded to it, who also voiced support for that idea. So,
it's one thing to say you voice support for a proposal that comes before you. Did anybody come to the consultation and say, you know what, we think the solution to this is to have an overarching board?
It may not be what you asked, but that's what I'm answering. I'm telling you there are people in the Ministerial Review Group who never had a proposal in front of them, but came forward saying they supported the idea of a single overarching board. They represented bodies which were consulted, and that's what their view was.
So the government makes a proposal, and people, in some case, agree with it. Of the 4 boards, you see the 4 agencies were represented. They're able to, they're going to be part of as this goes forward. Do they have the freedom to speak out against government policy if they think it's going to be damaging? Publicly.
Can I just say that, again, your first statement was incorrect. I didn't say there was a proposal from the government that people then agreed with. I'm saying people came back from the consultation, as part of the consultation, and made that point. It's an important distinction to make.
I'm sorry, I'm not clear what the distinction is.
Well, you've said, I think, twice now that we made a proposal which then people could choose to agree with. I'm saying that's not what happened. There was no proposal during the course of the Ministerial Review Group. People came forward voluntarily and said that they thought a single overarching board was a good idea within that Ministerial Review Group.
Who said that?
Well, we had it in the context of the Ministerial Review Group.
Which organisations came forward independently and said they believed, not that they agreed with the government's proposal, they independently believed that this, in fact, they brought this proposal onto the table, that there should be an overarching board.
Well, I mean, it's probably invidious to mention people that are involved in the Ministerial Review Group, but the College of Scotland were one example, but others can be seen from a perusal of the consultation responses, which are all publicly available.
Okay.
And there was a second part to your question, if you just remind me what that was.
I'm interested in, you've said that the agencies are involved have going to be part of this group and they're going to have the freedom to contribute to what happens next. Do they have the freedom to speak publicly about the implications of the proposals for an overarching board? Because I think that would give people some comfort. You know, you will be aware that we had a conversation with the Scottish Funding Council about the fact they give advice privately to ministers but would not make that public. Are they able to speak publicly about these proposals and implications they believe for the economy and for skills?
No order that people can't speak publicly. In fact, one of the members of the review group would be at University of Scotland, who have spoken very publicly, have voiced their concerns. So people, of course, and that's the purpose of the Ministerial Review Group. The idea was to have people most involved in the sector that can actually give advice straightforwardly to government. And of course, some of them have chosen to make that public, and that's their right to do so.
I'm interested to know to what extent the Scottish Government itself has an open mind in this. Is it possible, given what Mr Swinney has said about this, and it would appear to have said that things have already been decided, is it possible at the end of this process the Scottish Government decides that in fact an overarching board would be overly bureaucratic, would not be able to deal with regional difference and so on, and may actually not pursue that proposal? Or is that something that's been decided that should happen through the second stage?
It has been decided, and we wouldn't have decided it if we thought it was going to be overly bureaucratic. That wasn't the idea behind it. In fact, it's one way of helping to achieve the alignment which I mentioned and decluttering the system. So that, yes, we have decided, and what I've said is now being looked at by not just the original members of the Ministerial Review Group, but now involving all the members of those bodies, is the governance structure around that. So we have a very open mind as to that. And of course, that's the area in which both, for example, University of Scotland, the Funding Council, I'm sure will be very involved in the governance process to make sure the concerns which they've expressed are dealt with in terms of the governance structure.
So you've started with your own proposal, and this stage two is now is the responsibility for people to make it work. Is how that process is carried out rather than the issue of the principle of this overarching board.
No, we didn't. Again, I think for the third time, we didn't start with the proposal. We started with the review. We had a Ministerial Review Group. We had a consultation which led us to the proposal for the single overarching board. We're now going into the second phase of the process, where the governance structure of that board is what will be examined. And we do have an open mind. I've assured the members of that board that that's the case. They will lead in relation to how we take forward the governance structure. So it's an open process. They have the chance to influence it and to make sure the concerns which they have are expressed by what we eventually agree.
But for the absence of doubt, there will be an overarching board?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz.
Thank you. Can I just follow up, Cabinet Secretary, on the questions that Joanne Lamont has asked? And can I refer you to the comments that have been made by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, who have no problem about the need for a better industrial and research and innovation strategy, none at all. But they do raise two very specific issues, one of which is exactly akin to what Joanne Lamont was asking, where they say that the Phase 1 report indicates that Phase 2 of the review will be about the implementation of the conclusions, with there having been very little parliamentary scrutiny to date as to whether these conclusions are well-founded. The second point they make is they say that the Royal Society notes that the publication report in Phase 1, but is concerned that it does not present a strong evidence base for the approach that the Scottish Government proposes to take in establishing this new statutory board. Could you tell us, in your view, where you think the evidence is, where is the clear evidence that what you are proposing, and you've just indicated that it is firm proposals that will go ahead, where is the evidence to support this plan?
Well, I think both in terms of what we did produce and actually reported on to Parliament, we had a debate on it in Parliament. So the conclusions that we have reached as part of Phase 1 are backed up by the evidence which was published at that time. I've given you the rationale for us undertaking the review in the first place in terms of what we have not achieved, which we now want to achieve. We've had the involvement of all the different stakeholders and a very active consideration by the people on the Ministerial Review Group who represent, for example, University Scotland, they represent the college sector, they represent businesses. Business is also very seized of the view that we should, going back to the previous point, have undertaken this as quickly as possible. I should add that perhaps the pace at which this is being carried out is also underlined by the new environment in which we find ourselves in terms of Brexit. There was expressed by a number of people the need for urgency to do this because of a very rapidly changing situation in terms of Brexit, which obviously impacts in terms of international activity. So we have that background. And as you say, the Royal Society have mentioned those things that have actually been quite supportive in terms of some of the proposals. But I suppose the other point to make is we haven't finished this review yet. We've come to some conclusions, but as to how those are fleshed out over the course of the whole review, which of course will then result by all means, by most estimations, in a further parliamentary process and indeed a legislative process. Again, there's a further opportunity for parliamentary scrutiny then. So whether individual members want to look at the evidence base for what we're doing at that time, it's up to, they can see what we've produced so far. They'll see further evidence of that when we come to the conclusion of phase 2, and they can take their own view on that. And it will be interesting, I think, to see from the Royal Society and others who've commented their view once we've reached conclusions after phase 2 of the report. I don't know whether Paul wants to add to that point.
Well, at the same time as Call for Evidence, we commissioned a number of academics to look at international comparisons to see how they shaped up against our own perspective. So we had Professor Alan McGregor look at operations in places like Denmark, Norway, Northern Ireland, New Zealand, where there was clear evidence of a more joined-up and coordinated approach, seems in terms of ensuring that we provide a coherent approach to the development of skills and learning. So that was coupled with a report from Dr. David Skilling as well, looking at international business support as well. So that fed into, obviously, the consideration of the decisions and recommendations that came out of phase 1.
One of the key pieces of evidence was in the Skilling report in relation to HE. So we topped the league in terms of people going through HE, but given what I said earlier on about economic performance and productivity, we haven't had the dividends you might have expected from that level of investment. So one of the conclusions in one of those reports was that it may be the case that investment in more essential basic skills than those delivered at HE could provide a bigger economic impact. So both of those reports were things which the whole Ministerial Review Group considered in the process of the first part of the review.
Cabinet Secretary, I don't think there's any disagreement about the need for a strategy. I think that's very clear, in fact, of all the submissions that I've read. And indeed, the parliamentary debate that took place was very much about some of the issues that you've set out here and what can be done about that. I think the real concern, however, is what evidence do you have to ensure that the new board, the overarching board, which will abolish, as I understand it, the existing boards and have a new board, and which, if your answer to Joanne Lamont is accurate, you are suggesting will happen. What is the evidence on which you are basing that decision that it will work better when we have a lot of the institutions involved who are raising pretty serious concerns about the abolition of some of these boards? I know some of my colleagues will come back to this a bit later on. What's the evidence that it is going to work better? Because I, quite frankly, can't see it.
Well, the evidence, as I've said, we produced a substantial amount of that at the time of the Part 1 conclusions. But I mean, the other evidence that we took, for example, was from people that are currently being if you like, provided with services from either Highlands and Islands Enterprise or either account managed companies. We took evidence from those that are using the services of Skills Development Scotland just now. I was very keen at the start of the process that we actually had the evidence from people receiving those services. And those led us to the picture that there was elements of duplication, that there was not the level of joint working that we wanted to see happen. I've mentioned in relation to international activities. And I have to say, to some extent, that was reinforced by some of the contributions from people from the agencies themselves. So, you know, whether, for example, HIE currently get the level of service they require in terms of international activity through SDI, whether there's a level of collaboration there should be between universities when they're acting overseas and SDI and other elements of government as well. So we took a substantial amount of evidence. We have produced that evidence so far, and we will produce further evidence as we go through phase 2 for the conclusions then.
Could you clarify something, Cabinet Secretary? My understanding is that the Scottish Funding Council Board, as it exists just now, would no longer be in existence, and there would be a new overarching board. If you abolish the current Funding Council Board, you effectively abolish the Scottish Funding Council because they are one and the same thing. Is that what you intend to do?
Well, we've said what we've said in terms of the existing boards, but you're right to suggest that there's still an open question as to what function, what should be the form of the governance structure which applies in relation to the Funding Council, in particular to the universities. So, as I've said, what we have is a piece of work being undertaken in terms of the governance structure, which will look at those issues. We'll come back to how that is best serviced, and you've heard some of the concerns in relation to ensuring academic freedom is preserved, ensuring that ministers are not able to take certain decisions. It should be at one remove from ministers. So those things are actively being considered, and they will involve both the Funding Council and University Scotland being involved in those considerations. But we've not reached the stage of reaching a conclusion on that yet.
Right, so there are obviously some conclusions, but there are other conclusions that don't exist. In other words, you are categorically saying this morning that you have not made a decision about the governance structure of this new board. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes. We made that clear in the debate.
Okay, okay.
Thank you very much, Richard, and then Tavish.
I just want to ask one question under this theme and come back to HIE, if that's okay, in a short while when we turn to that issue. As someone who's been in Parliament since '99, I've had £1 for every time politicians across all the parties call for a bonfire of the Quangles or for the public sector landscape to be streamlined. I'd be a very rich man. So I very much understand where the government are coming from and what the government's trying to achieve and support much of that agenda. I'd just like to comment on where regional policy sits in terms of where we're going with this review, because there's a number of initiatives happening across Scotland, and I just want to understand better how regional policy has been delivered. So you have this review, you have city-region deals, and a number of other initiatives. So, but the city-region deals tend to be focused on the cities, and I'd like to explain what the difference is between a city's policy and a regional policy in Scotland, because my fear is that we may have a national approach in some respects and a city approach in other respects, and all the areas in between fall through the net. So I just would wonder if you can expand on how the government's trying to deliver regional policy in Scotland.
Yeah, I would say that you're quite correct in relation to the, I would have described it, the unique nature of the city deal framework which is emerging. Of course, that was an initiative which began in the Glasgow region with ourselves, the UK government and the relevant local authorities proposing that. And the one thing I would say in relation to city deals, I think you're right to say they don't fit readily into the current structures that we have, and I think for that reason it's quite right to look at those structures again. But I think it's also true to say that a feature of city deals which do involve much more than the cities because of the nature of the deal. So Aberdeen involves Aberdeenshire, a number of authorities which are not cities involved in the Glasgow deal. Stirling involves Clackmannanshire, obviously not a city. The Tay Cities deal, despite its title, will involve more than cities as well. So they do involve more than cities, but I understand your point about how does that fit currently with regional policy. I think the one thing I'd say I'm keen that we in phase 2, which is when we'll examine this in more detail, is to preserve that, because I think the benefit of those is these have been, if you like, organically grown through local authorities. In each of the deals that we have, the projects and initiatives that ourselves and the UK government are funding are ones which local authorities themselves have said they want, and I think there's something vitally important about that. So we want to maintain those, and of course our stated aim is to further look with encouragingly on those deals which are still to emerge. So Tay Cities has been mentioned, Edinburgh has been mentioned, and the Stirling and Clackmannanshire deals, which I think, if I'm right, will take all of the cities in Scotland, but much more than that. Beyond that, I think that we are looking at terms of regionalisation, and one of the conclusions of the first phase of the review was to establish a new South of Scotland agency to look in particular at that area because of some of the views that we'd had expressed, some of the evidence that had been led to us in terms of concerns people had felt there. Perhaps the most frequently expressed anecdote was, if you look at the respective trajectories of Inverness and Dumfries over a number of years, Inverness has done very well. Dumfries, these people said, less so, and how can we have that focus in terms of south of Scotland? So, and as I say, the issue of regionalisation is something that's one of the work streams that's being developed just now. For my part, I don't think we should be too rigid in how that develops. I think, as I've mentioned, City Deal, there is something very important about the fact that this is developed from local authorities themselves. So whether it's the nature of the geographical areas which are covered by different initiatives, or whether it's in the nature of what services are provided, I think we have a relatively open mind as we go through phase 2. So whether, you know, I'm not suggesting this is what's going to happen, but if a proposal comes forward that we should look at skills and some of the functions of local authorities being delivered in a different way from one area to another, then I think that's something we should look at. So it's not tidy and clean. I'm happy to concede that, but I do think, not least in relation to City Deals, there's something organic and vital about the way that we're providing these services.
Okay. I mean, my only, if I can just make a very quick comment, is that I'd urge ministers to look at this a bit more closely, because we have this review, but we've got various other initiatives as well. And I need to, and I'm sure Parliament wants to be confident, that's delivering a proper regional policy, which is not just the skills and enterprise review doing one thing and then looking at the cities as a way of addressing some of the other issues, but the rest of Scotland falls through the net. And I think there's a real danger of that happening if we don't think through what regional policy in Scotland looks like, and particularly learn from other countries.
I would just say in relation to the cities review, it's worth bearing in mind though, if you were to look at the 7 cities of Scotland and the likely deals which will emerge in relation to them, the area covered by those which are not cities will vastly exceed the areas which are covered by the cities, given the way that the city deals are configured. Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen. Inverness is the only one which stands alone for, I think, fairly obvious reasons. But again, in Glasgow, with the 7 or 8 other authorities involved in that, which are not cities. So the area covered by the city deals is very substantially greater than the cities themselves. But I take the point that you make.
You
I'll come back in each.
Go ahead now.
Is each now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, in terms of the review, as I said before, I understand where the government's trying to get to in terms of addressing the public sector landscape. But Jim Hunter, the Highland historian and former chairman of Highlands and Islands Enterprise, of course, wrote a scathing article about the decision to disband the Highlands and Islands Enterprise Board. And I think, therefore, it would be good to hear what comfort you can give Jim Hunter and other people in Highlands and Islands who have expressed concern over that decision, because clearly people want to know how Highlands and Islands interests are going to be represented in the overarching framework.
Yeah, I think what we've said, both going back to the debate that we held in Parliament on that, is that Highlands and Islands Enterprise itself will remain. It will remain as a legal entity. They will remain with a chief executive based in Inverness, with the headquarters based in Inverness. The same people that are currently providing the services to individuals and to companies in the Highlands and Islands will be providing those same services to those same companies and hopefully many more. And that was something that came back to us in the evidence. People said that they valued those services. In relation to the board, I think it's important that we await the outcome of the governance initiatives which I've mentioned previously. So for phase 2 of the report, to see how those things which some people like Jim Hunter have been talked about are further preserved and ensured in terms of the continuation after that governance review. And just to mention that Highlands and Islands Enterprise, of course, will be intrinsically involved in that governance review as well. So, and I think the other thing to say is that the initiative here, going back to a previous question, was the extent to which bodies can get the support and work actively with other public bodies to achieve more. So if you look at, for example, many of the initiatives in the Highlands in recent years, the Mistodloch bypass, to mention the local one, but the A9, we're the first government to commit to dualling the A9, the first government to commit to dualling the A96. We have struck a city deal for Inverness. The recent work done by my colleague Fergus Ewing in terms of the Rio Tinto a development, further development in Fort William, whereby 130 plus jobs have been safeguarded with the prospect of many more. These things have often been achieved either not through HIE or through HIE working with other bodies. And we want to try and maximise our ability to do that in future. And in relation specifically to HIE, I think their ability to work on an international basis, I think, is very important. SE and SDI have a particular relationship, obviously, but I don't think we've had sufficiently the ability to prosecute those interests of HIE on the international stage in the way that I like to see happen. So whether it's through universities or whether it's through SDI, I think we want to maximise the international opportunities that are there as well. So I think we'll have something greater than what we have just now as a result of these changes. And in terms of the governance, people should take a view on that once they see exactly what's proposed in relation to Highlands and Islands.
Okay. Well, just to close, I just say that I think it's important that ministers keep an open mind in terms of listening closely to the concerns being expressed in the Highlands and Islands in terms of how we address those concerns.
Tavish.
And can I ask if the chairman of Highlands and Islands Enterprise is allowed to say publicly what his views are on the abolition of his board?
Tavish Scott will know as well as I the code of conduct for people appointed to government bodies, but there's been no injunction on Lon Crerar not to speak out. In fact, I think he's spoken out a number of occasions in relation to this.
Well, he told Highlands and Islands MSPs last night he wasn't going to speak out publicly.
Can't really comment on third-party conversations, convener.
Could you give me a practical example of what you just said to Richard Lockhead, which is where SDI have not been servicing High properly?
Well, I think if you look at the evidence, I think it were said that there was a narrow base. I think it came up during the course of the Ministerial Review Group that level of support from SDI could be greater. We've had that expressed to us, but
Just to help
well,
me
you
understand
can't
this.
give an example of investment that didn't happen. So I think that's.
But you said there was evidence from companies that you'd been discussing this with, which I thought was a very fair point. So you must have some evidence. I'm just asking if you could lay it in front of the committee.
As I said, convener, I don't think you can give an example of an investment that hasn't happened, but we did get that evidence led to us, both in terms of the Ministerial Review Group and submissions from others.
Well, could
that
you
they
write
felt
to
there
the-
could be a higher level of international support.
If there's submissions that they could be sent to the committee, then I'd
Happy
be
to do that, convener.
Thank you.
And similarly, could you furnish the committee, I don't expect today, but in writing, with a specific list of the organisations or individuals who said that a central board was the right solution for the structure that you've described?
We already have published all the submissions, convener.
No, but could you send to the committee a specific letter with the specific organisations and bodies who've said that, as Joanne Lamont was asking you earlier on?
Well, I have mentioned, what I will do is examine whether the minutes of the Ministerial Review Group where this issue was raised can be published, and if we're able to do that, I'm happy to do that and publish those. But that will be in addition, of course, to the 329 submissions that we received in our call for evidence.
I'm really sorry, I'm trying not to be awkward here. I'm just asking for a specific list that Joanne Lamont asked for as well of the organisations or individuals who specifically said as part of your consultation there should be a single board. That's all I'm asking for. I'm not asking for minutes, I'm asking for the evidence that helps us to understand the case you're making, Minister.
I've heard the question now twice from Tavish Scott. I've given my answer, convener.
Thank you very much.
So why are we not going to get it? Why are we not going to get it then?
Well, the Cabinet Secretary has answered.
Well, with respect, it's not an answer if it says I'm not going to answer the question.
Well, it gave an answer.
So we're not going to get that evidence, right? Okay, so there is no evidence then. Will a minister chair this new single board?
Sorry?
Will a minister chair this new single board?
As I've said, that we have a stream of work being undertaken in terms of the governance of that strategic board, so that will be one of the outcomes. We'll decide who's chairing and the membership of that board as a result of the work that we take forward in terms of the governance structure.
So it could be a minister?
Well, we won't know that until we've had the work stream that's undertaken.
Okay, well, let me ask it the other way. You haven't ruled out a minister chairing the single board?
Well, what we've said in the first instance is that the people most involved in this, so the agencies themselves and those on the Ministerial Review Group, should look at this governance structure. They will then report back to the Ministerial Review Group, and we'll look at that time.
I think that means you haven't ruled out a minister potentially chairing this board. Do you take the view that the UHI regional governance outcome has been positive for the future of the UHI and therefore for skills in the Highlands and Islands?
Well, I think I've mentioned in relation to skills, that's kind of out with my area in terms of UHI. Obviously, they work into Scottish Funding Council. But I have mentioned already where I think there has been some duplication. That's been said by a number of members of different parties in this Parliament. And whether the right balance is there between universities, colleges, local authorities and Skills Development Scotland is one of the things that we're actively considering in relation to the regionalisation work stream, which I mentioned earlier on.
Could you give me an example of that duplication you've just described?
Well, again, it's sometimes when we have apprenticeships, when we have colleges sometimes cutting across which those activities which SDS are involved in, and some of the evidence that we had in terms of the people which came to the Ministerial Review Group said there was uncertainty in terms of which body was responsible for them. So if that feeling is out there, whether or not it's the case, then it's something that we have to address. So you'll have seen not the usual cliche of a one-door approach, but mention of any door approach, where people looking to access services for skills, whether it's through local authorities, SDS, or those services funded by the Funding Council, that the people that are trying to access those find it as easy as possible to do so. And we had that representation made to us both in the Ministerial Review Group and it's in the submissions which were made as a result of the call for evidence.
Would it be possible to give the committee some specific examples of that were presented to the Ministerial Review Group?
I'm happy to do that.
Thank you. Do you believe that the challenge we have around engineering, maths and science, specifically after yesterday's PISA report, is helped by the narrowing of choice at the curriculum, senior curriculum levels of our secondary schools?
I have to say, Convener, that wasn't part of the review that we are carrying out in terms of the skills and enterprise companies.
But it'd be part of the Scottish Funding Council's consideration of the work they do at the moment.
The Scottish Funding Council's work obviously covers areas substantially out with, as well as included within the scope of this review, but that area was not part of the review.
So how would a single board therefore address that issue?
I've mentioned what I believe would be the strengths of a single board, which I think are in relation to the alignment across different agencies to make sure that we can drive out duplication and more effectively focus effort. Those things would apply across the activities of the different agencies.
But you said that issue hasn't been addressed as part of the skills review, and I take that point. Would it be addressed by a single board?
Well, as I've said, I think what the strengths of the single board are, both from those that made representations in favour of it, those that spoke for it as well, and the basis of our conclusion are those strengths that will bring a greater focus and will help drive out duplication. In terms of curriculum, as I've said, we intend, as part of the governance review that flows from phase 1, that the protections that should be in place so that ministers don't get involved in directing curriculum activities or also have one removed from research and other aspects of university funding. That will be something that will feature in the governance review. So and that particular point, as I've said, lay out with the scope of the review that we carried out.
So an issue that currently is dealt with by the Funding Council Board, I think you're accepting that it is dealt by the Funding Council Board. We don't know where that issue would then be dealt with because we don't know it wasn't considered as part of the skills review.
I think education ministers will tell you exactly how they are dealing with that. I'm just saying it's out with the scope of the review that we carried out.
But it's currently dealt with by a board that you're proposing to abolish.
Yeah. Well, perhaps Paul would want to answer that point.
Sorry, there was a decision in the first phase of the review to incorporate a look at the learner journey from 15 to 24, specifically looking at the pathways and the availability of information to young people in terms of how they navigate their way through education and training. So that will be an integral part of phase 2 of the review, the undertaking of that learner journey.
So will it be considered by this single board that you want to propose?
I mean, the learner journey is part of phase 2, but whatever conclusions it comes up with will obviously be referred through to the transition or interim setup that will accompany the...
You would at least concede that if Alice Brown and John Kent were here today, they'd answer all these questions because they know the detail of this. They're on the policy bit. It's their responsibility of the policy bit. And what I'm putting to you today is there's no evidence that these issues will be considered by your new board.
I've had a number of discussions with both Alice and John, and of course Alice is on the Ministerial Review Group and is perfectly able to put forward these issues to the extent that she thinks they should form part of what we do now. We mentioned the governance structure, but also one of the work streams which Paul has just mentioned, the learner journey, which is just exactly what we've been describing, trying to make it as clear as possible for people trying to navigate their way through skills and learning support as they go through the system. So, you know, we have people both from University Scotland and from the Funding Council on the Ministerial Review Group, and of course those things can be taken into account to the extent they want to mention them.
If there's no Scottish Funding Council board, where do things like the capital allocations for colleges get sorted out?
Well, exactly as I've said before, that the governance structure is what will lay out how these things are dealt with. So we have agreed there will be the overarching board. What we've not agreed, and what is open for discussion and review through the Ministerial Review Group and others, is exactly how those things will be allocated. So we have reached that conclusion in favour of an overarching board. We know there are quite a number of subsidiary discussions and structural solutions to be found in relation to that, and that will flow from phase 2. We're at phase 1 of the review. We're entering phase 2 just now. It's not a complete review. Those things are being looked at currently.
But you'd accept there's a huge amount of detail, I apologise, Convener, a huge amount of detail that the Scottish Funding Council Board already deal with, which will have to be replicated by the new super board you're appointing, multiplied by 4, because it's 4 different agencies.
Well, actually 5, because we're creating a new agency, South of Scotland agency. But yes, all that data, and that's why the Funding Council, why University Scotland and many others are involved in the Ministerial Review Group to make sure those things are taken into account.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
I'd like to focus my questions on the Scottish Funding Council. Could you just point to me which page of the Phase 1 report does it recommend that the board of Scottish Funding Council should be dissolved and subsumed by the new super board?
I don't have it in front of me, but it was mentioned, I made it clear in the phase 1 discussion that it took place in Parliament, and made it clear a number of times since, so it's quite public knowledge.
In the document?
Sorry?
Is it in the document?
Well, you have the advantage on me, you've got the document in front of you.
Because on page 5, point number 1, talks about a Scotland-wide statutory board to coordinate the activities of HIE, SE, including SDS and SFC. Do you not think the word coordinate's a little bit different to what has now been proposed, which is, I say, direct governance of those bodies by the overarching board?
Well, I don't think direct governance is currently being proposed. The issue of governance is still being discussed as part of phase 2. So, you know, we've had already a number of suggestions from members of the Ministerial Review Group, from members indeed of the agencies themselves, making points about the governance review that they'd like to see replicated. So the governance of these agencies is something which is now, we're only halfway through the review. The second part of the review is still being undertaken, and that will look most crucially, as I've said, at the issues of governance.
So I'm a bit confused, because in response to a question from Ian Gray, the Deputy First Minister said that the boards of the Scottish Funding Council and SDS would go, and that those functions would be subsumed by the new overarching board. Was he not correct in that statement?
Well, as I've said, absolutely right. The boards are going to go. The governance structure, which will be brought in instead of that, will be decided as part of phase 2 of the review.
Sorry, are the boards going or not? I'm getting very confused by your answers. I don't know how I can say it more clearly, Convener, that boards,
for the benefit of Daniel Johnson, the boards are going. I've said that, I think, 3 times now. I don't know what the ambiguity is, to be honest.
But then the document's not clear.
Well, I'm telling you now, so I've said it 3 times.
Can you just explain to me which experts recommended abolishing the Scottish Funding Council Board, and was this particular point discussed and agreed upon by the Ministerial Review Group?
No, the purpose of it was discussed by the Ministerial Review Group, but no, it wasn't. The Ministerial Review Group was there to make sure that all the stakeholders involved in the sector were able to provide their views. The decisions were taken by ministers. The decision was taken collectively by ministers, and that's our decision.
So can you not understand that the concern there is that we had a phase 1 document which didn't make this point explicit, that then in response to a question it was made explicit by the Deputy First Minister well in advance of the phase 2 document, which is going to be published, I believe, in March. Do you not understand the concerns that people don't really understand what bits are up for consultation and what bits are predetermined?
You know, I've made it publicly known for substantial number of weeks now. For example, in the Convention of the Highlands and Islands, again asked that specific question, made it very clear. I think all the boards, well, certainly Highlands and Islands, Skills Development Scotland and Universities Scotland, so the Funding Council, were all in attendance at that meeting. It's been made plain a number of times in public fora.
So, I mean, in recent weeks, this committee has heard essentially the results of a wide number of educational reforms. We've heard about, from Education Scotland, who couldn't explain the fall in literacy or very poor explanations of the issues faced by teachers in terms of curriculum for excellence. We've heard directly from Ruth Brown, who said the issues around the reformed qualifications were in their design, implementation and the way they work. So when it comes to reforming the way our universities work, why should we trust the government given the issues with these fundamental reforms we've had in previous education reforms? And given the controversy, will you commit today to putting these proposals forward in primary legislation so that they can have proper parliamentary scrutiny?
I think on the first part of Daniel Johnson's question, that's not the subject of this review. We're not looking to reform the universities in this review. That's not part of what we're doing. And also the issues in relation to educational standards, I think will be for education ministers to take up. On your last point, though, about committing to legislation, I would just go back to the point I made before, that the governance structures are being looked at just now in terms of phase 2 of the report. The necessity and the nature of any legislative outcome from that will be driven by what those governance decisions are. So you can see a situation, of course, where if there's a need for primary legislation, either for the establishment of the new board or for other subsidiary organisations, then of course it will have to come back to Parliament to legislate for that. But the nature of that legislation will be driven by the nature of the outcomes of the governance review. I don't think that's puzzling at all.
I'll tell you what I'm very puzzled by is the claim that you can somehow reform the way our universities are governed and claim that that doesn't constitute a reform of the way of our universities. I mean, clearly governance and the way universities operate are absolutely and intimately linked. And further to that, could you point to me what's broken with our university system that needs this level of reform? I mean, my understanding is that our universities produce more spin-out companies and receive more competitively awarded research funding than any other part of the United Kingdom. So what's broken, and why do they need this reform?
Just to repeat, if I could, that we are not seeking to reform universities as part of this review, which I think was what you've said, reform of universities. That's not what we're seeking to do. But you have raised the issue of spin-out companies from universities. Now, one of the submissions that we heard was about the nature of those spin-outs, and there's been tremendous success, if you think about Edinburgh, Stirling, many at Strathclyde, Aberdeen, many universities have had huge success. There are people in the private sector that sometimes feel that the universities will often take too high an equity stake in those companies, which negates their further growth. There are questions about whether the spin-outs result in scale-ups, where those companies become more substantial. So these are live questions, which of course are within the domain of economic development, and so we have considered those. What we're not considering is the reform of universities themselves. That was never part of the review.
Can you just clarify that point? How on earth can you claim that reforming governance, which is as fundamental as how they're funded, especially around teaching, and claim that that's not a reform of our universities?
All I can say is we are not reforming the universities. The agency, the Scottish Funding Council, is part of this review. Universities and the way they're structured is not part of this review. The governance of the 4 agencies, in fact, to become 5 agencies, is what's been looked at in terms of this governance, not the reform of the universities themselves.
My original point on this, as I understand it, the Scottish Funding Council Board is going. You've confirmed that. The Scottish Funding Council Board is effectively the Scottish Funding Council. Therefore, that is going. To take up Daniel Johnson's point, that will inevitably mean a reform of the funding and governance structures of our universities. There is no other way to answer that. Do you agree that that is a fundamental change?
It is a fundamental change. This review will result in fundamental changes, and I've said what I've said a number of times now about the Funding Council itself. What is still open, what is to be decided, is the nature of the governance. Now, you will have heard, as I have heard, concerns expressed. We've had it at the Ministerial Review Group as well, where the University of Scotland and the Funding Council have said that they have particular concerns that certain things are preserved within that governance structure. So they are going to be intrinsically involved in how we develop the new structure, the governance structure, and it will be designed to protect those things which are very important to that sector.
But Cabinet Secretary, that is a massive change of policy, if you don't mind me saying. And I think that, when we had the governance review of universities in the last Parliament, which created a great deal of controversy, I may say, If there is a proposal for something new, surely that should have parliamentary scrutiny, and the government should be able to set out not only what it wants to achieve, but the evidence base to support what it wants to achieve. I can't see that just now.
Well, that is, we haven't, as I've said, I've just mentioned in relation to the governance structure, we haven't finalised that yet. In fact, we're really in the middle of the consideration of those issues in terms of the governance structure. And of course, when we come to the conclusion of that, then of course, Parliament will have the chance to debate that. It's not for me anyway. Other parties may want to ensure that, but I'm pretty sure. Well, I think, as I've said before, that the nature of the single board and also some of the other issues will require, are very likely to require legislation, but the exact nature of that won't be obvious until we've concluded in terms of the governance structures. But even in addition to that, phase one of the report was the subject of a statement and a debate in the Parliament. Phase two, I would imagine, would also be a statement and also a debate in the Parliament, but that would only be a precursor to what is likely to be the full legislative process, as we have for other new legislative initiatives.
Yeah, thank you. Ross Thompson.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just first of all, I wanted to pick up on a question raised by Richard Lockhead, which was around the comments of the former chairman of HIE, Professor Jim Hunter. In that article that Richard Lockhead referred to in the Press and Journal, he was quoted as saying that rather than building on the success of HIE, that the Scottish Government have instead, and I'll quote, cut HIE's budget, abolished its 10 local enterprise companies, and turn the organisation into a Scottish Government delivery agency, with centralisation, and again I quote, run riot. What is this Cabinet Secretary's response to those particular criticisms? I'd be interested just to hear your view on those particular points. And also you'll be aware that the Press and Journal itself is running a long-term campaign, which is Keep HIE Local. I was wondering if the Cabinet Secretary would consider supporting it.
On the first serious point which is raised by Ross Thompson, I think it's, if you start from the position of saying that there have been budget cuts, and I think we all know, I think you, especially as a Conservative member, will know all about budget cuts, given that the government you support has been responsible for the vast majority of them and the cuts of this Parliament. So you'll know about the budget cuts. And if your position is, as has been expressed there, that there have been budget cuts and what you said about local enterprise boards, and it's a vehicle for centralisation, if that's where you start off, then how can you then go on to say this represents centralisation? We have said we are guaranteeing the continued existence of Highlands and Islands agency, that the Chief Executive will still be there. We have not concluded in terms of the governance of that agency. There will still be the same level of control and discretion and decision making which they currently enjoy. What we are trying to achieve through this is my response to the point that you make, is that we think we can achieve more. And in fact, we've had demands for more to be done in all sorts of areas, as you'll be aware as well, whether it's increasing job opportunities, the value of those job opportunities, job stability, and also increased economic activity. We believe we can achieve more by the work that we're undertaking in the nature of this review. So we think this is a very positive thing for the Highlands and Islands. We think it's building on the best of what's there already and will serve the greater interest of the Highlands and Islands.
Okay. Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. With obviously all due respect, we're talking about the political choices of the Scottish Government and the areas of wholly responsibility that you have, and I'm sure the public will see through the blaming of anybody else. Last week, Public Audit Committee, Alistair Sim of University of Scotland, during questioning, said in relation to the single proposed super board, and again I'll quote him, that a limited number of people sitting around a table will not have the competence to deal with the huge remit that the board could be given. So therefore, Minister, is there a danger that a new single board could be set up to be too big to function, and will we be setting up to fail?
I don't think it's going to be set up to fail. Whether it's set up as too big to function, I think that issue is something that has to be and is being considered as part of the governance review. So the extent to which there is a requirement for additional expertise, additional capacity in relation to that is something that's being looked at just now. And University of Scotland, who Alistair Sim obviously represents, are intrinsically involved in that process. And just to come back to the point you started with, political choices or spending choices are not taken in a vacuum. The choices that we make in this Parliament are intrinsically influenced and directed by the resources which we are provided with. That's why I mentioned the cuts that we've had from successive Conservative governments.
sure he'll be using the new powers of the Scottish Parliament to rectify anything he believes wrong. But thank you, Convener, on the topic at hand. In the same session, Cabinet Secretary, Mr Sim stated that the role of such a single board again should take on an expert view that challenges government, tells it what it has to do to achieve the results that it wants, and also that it has to have the ability to challenge universities as well, because he says that that intermediary role of being able to challenge both ways is incredibly important. In evidence sessions we've had from other agencies, particularly Education Scotland, a lot of the submission feedback was concern about an increasing politicisation of the agency and the inability sometimes of challenge to be brought to government. I mean, what safeguards do you think can be put in place to ensure that we don't see that type of politicisation creep into any new board?
Well, I think the thing to say is that the performance of these agencies, in any event, always comes back to political accountability. Ministers are held responsible for the performance of agencies. I think the first 2 points that you quoted from Alistair Sim are very good points. The challenge both ways, I think, is extremely important, and that's partly why we've had the Ministerial Review Group, so we can be challenged in our thinking. It's partly why in the first phase of the review we didn't include the agencies. We wanted it not to be the system representing itself. We wanted to have others that were accessing the system telling us how they found their experience to be, and there were some challenging evidence sessions in relation to that, both for HIE, for Scottish Enterprise, and for others. So I think that in terms of how we develop the governance structures, we want to do, just as Alistair Sim has said, is to build in that challenge. The actual review itself is responding to a challenge, which is that we've not achieved as much as we have, bearing in mind, as I've mentioned many times in the Chamber, there are two governments involved in the economy of Scotland. The UK government is intrinsically involved as well. You wouldn't think that, of course, from the Conservative response to many economic data that are produced, but they are. So I think having that kind of level of challenge is very important, and that can be reflected in what comes forward as part of the governance review that's been undertaken.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. In relation to theme 2, Convener, I had a couple of questions under that particular theme. Would you like me to ask those?
Just go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Cabinet Secretary, in the submissions to the review, I noticed that the Scottish Cities Alliance had given some feedback, and part of their comment was a need to align the Scottish Funding Council funding of further education with regional needs of employers. And obviously, as the Cabinet Secretary will be aware, there are particular regional needs, particularly in my own area in the North East, where there are skills shortages. The Phase 1 commentary from the government in response to that was that it did not share the view and did not support a regional or local approach. Could the Cabinet Secretary expand on that a bit further?
Well, if what's been talked about is in relation to skills, which you mentioned, then I think there is scope. As I've said, we're looking at regionalisation for things to be considered. So I suppose we will be considering the view of the best dispensation of skills. One area, for example, Ayrshire, I think it is possible to point to, I'd have to see the context of the quote that you've provided there. I think it is possible to see there are specific skills requirements in different parts of the country. Now, if that's what flows from the Phase 2, and as I say, it's not for me to preempt it, we'll wait to see what comes back from the work streams which are being commissioned. But if that's what flows back from that, then we have an open mind. We've discussed both with COSLA, who have obviously an interest in this. They have, including the authorities involved in the not all of them, but the Cities Alliance that you've mentioned, a view that they would like additional discretion to be involved in these things. I think we have to keep an open mind in relation to that. And as an example of that open mind, I think the announcement that we've made to establish a new South of Scotland agency in terms of economic development shows that we are serious about that.
Actually, thank you very much for that, Cabinet Secretary, because following on from that, within the same submission, the SCA proposed sort of decentralisation on the principle of subsidiarity. So they talked about more fiscal and non-fiscal powers, and they'd put in some suggestions feeling that local authorities were better placed to incentivise investment, meet local need, again, if they had that. The Phase 1 report responses, though, seem to suggest strengthening coordination and control through, obviously, a national board. And actually looking at the responses and the specific ask around about fiscal and non-fiscal freedoms, there was actually no comment from the Scottish Government. So I was just wondering in the same way, would you be as open to those asks as you are to others?
Well, this ask has been made a number of times by the Scottish Cities Alliance and sometimes from individual members of the Scottish, and it's important to understand where that ask comes from. It's the Scottish Cities Alliance. So what I've said to them each time they've made this ask is, well, tell me what powers it is that you don't think you have just now, which are required. I mean, I'm an ex-local authority leader myself. I know the powers that local government has very substantial powers, and it's not clear to me genuinely what powers cities don't currently have that prevent them from doing some of these things. And so I've asked them to provide that kind of evidence, and more than that, to tell me what is intrinsic to cities, because this is not a demand from all local authorities. It may be shared by other local authorities, but it's been made by cities, and they say it's on behalf or in recognition of their particular requirements. So I've asked them to demonstrate to me, to provide the evidence, and of course it will be for Kevin Stewart and other ministers to look at this as well, what is specific, intrinsic to cities that requires additional powers. Now, there is one, for example, Edinburgh, I think possibly other authorities have talked about a tourist tax, but even that isn't necessarily restricted if it was to be applied to cities. It's possible that other local authorities would have that. So I think what's important to get from both the cities and local authorities is a coherent set of requirements that they have, which would apply across local authorities, unless it's the case that cities can specify what's intrinsic to being a city that means that they have to have additional powers. And what is it they need those additional powers for? What specifically do they want to do that they can't currently do? So, again, you're saying you're open to that. If they can provide evidence and suggestions, the government is open to that. And I take your point about that the powers of councils. I think a lot of them feel still constrained, given there has been an agenda of centralisation. I think they feel that given they contribute the 7 cities together, about 65 billion to 120 billion that Scotland generates in economic output, that's a significant proportion, and that they could, if given more fiscal levers, could potentially meet local need. But if I take it from the Cabinet Secretary, you are open to that if they were to submit evidence? Well, I think we've said as much to the cities, but I'll just say in terms of the, as you called it, the agenda of centralisation, I know my time as a local authority councillor goes back substantially before yours, but I remember when a huge chunk, up to 40% of our budget, was determined by ring-fence funding directed by central government. That no longer applies. There's been a substantial amount of decentralisation that's happened over a number of years, which I'm very pleased about. And also beyond that, as I've said, and I'm sure you'll know this from your own experience, local authorities have very substantial powers to act if they choose to do so, specific provisions in law to take action if they want to do that. I appreciate it. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And just to make the point, I think those living in the North East in relation to centralisation are obviously not keen on the idea of all the council tax that we raise going to the central belt. That's not very local.
Let's move on and try and concentrate on the skills review. Fulton, would you want to come in?
Convener, thanks, Cabinet Secretary, for attending today. And much of the questions I was going to ask you about have actually already been answered. Indeed, I've heard you clarify things sometimes 2 or 3 times for members' benefits. I'll come at a slightly different angle in terms of the board, the new board that's to be set up. I know we have a phase 2, but has any preference been given to you, any sort of idea of who would be likely to chair it?
No, I mean, you've seen, I'm sure, and I think Tavish Scott, if I'm right, mentioned that there's been public commentary on it, but I can't think, and I would have to check again in all the submissions or the deliberations of the Ministerial Review Group that people have made a specific recommendation. I don't think there has been, no.
And forgive me if you've already covered this, but has a possibility, or do you think it's a possibility, because I know we've got the phase 2, as you've said a few times, but do you think that the possibility of some sort of system with the various organisations could chair it on a sort of rolling basis?
Well, one or two suggestions already made, not about necessarily the chairing, but about the membership and governance structure. And whilst I've been happy to receive those and have discussions about them, I do think the driver for this has to be those within the Ministerial Review Group that are specifically being tasked to look at the governance structure. So there have been a number, a very small number, I think maybe 2, not proposals, but suggestions which are made. But I think it is more proper for the people involved in that, which will not be me directly, the people involved in that review. So in all likelihood, I would imagine that Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Scottish Funding Council and others, and what we said in terms of the Ministerial Review Group and these work streams which have been established is that nobody should be precluded. If somebody is not within that membership of taking forward that work stream forward, they should be able to say, I want to be involved in that. So it's an open process to that extent. But it's best that it flows, the suggestions flow from that work.
And you wanted to comment on?
Specifically on the HIE, I'm interested in this. You said that Inverness, if you looked at Inverness and Dumfries, there was a comparison with Inverness was thriving and perhaps Dumfries was struggling, and you had recognised that by establishing a board, and understand that that has been a popular decision, that there would be a development board for that area. What do you think has contributed to Inverness thriving in a way that you suggested Dumfries hadn't?
I didn't suggest it. I said that people had said that to us. It was actually more than one person had said that. So I was saying other people, I think if you check the record, had said that other people had said that to us. But I think there has been a substantial benefit to Inverness over a number of years. One would be, of course, the establishment as a city itself. The ones which I've more recently been involved in. I think the work that's been done previously by John Swinney in relation to the college that's there, by a number of people going back many years in terms of the building up of the life sciences sector within Inverness and the surrounding area. I think it's had a substantial boost from the perspective of, for the first time, going to be connected by either dual carriageway or motorway to the other cities of Scotland, which wasn't the case, is not the case just now, but it is in prospect of being the case by, first of all, 2025 and 2030. So I think there's been quite a number of things which have added to its success over recent years.
You would obviously accept that the role of HIE has been significant as well. If I can give us an example, I'm the child of a generation of people from the islands who felt they had to come to Glasgow for work. So my classroom was full of people from Islay, Lewis, Harris, wherever, because the islands, in particular in more rural areas, were becoming depopulated. My nephew's generation can contemplate the possibility of staying on their island of Lewis to work. I think many people would recognise the role of the old Highlands and Islands Development Board, and now HIE, has created that change. And there are still very fragile communities in Highlands and Islands. Would you accept that the autonomy and authority of HIE, previously Highland and Island Development Board, as described by Jim Hunter, was part of that change?
I think there's no question that HIE have contributed hugely to that. The point I tried to make earlier on is that many other things have done as well. RET to the Western Isles, I think, was a huge boon to the Western Isles. The introduction of road equivalent tariff and the substantial reduction in fares, I think, has been a huge boost.
Strategically, has it been significant? I mean, you can think of individual policies, but I'm asking you, do you accept that that change I describe from the 60s to now was about a strategic role and giving authority at a local level to not just be committed in economic development, but community regeneration and supporting the skills and development of communities within these islands and islands?
I think I've acknowledged a number of times now the work of HIE, which evolved, of course, as we're asking it to evolve now, previously from HIDB as well. But it's also the case that if you go to the Western, and I'm sure Joanne Lamont knows this as much as I do, there's been pretty trenchant criticism from the Western Isles about the extent to which HIE had been felt to decentralise as well in Inverness. I mean, I had that during the referendum campaign when I was involved in TV programmes. So you've had that criticism there in the past. So it's probably as well to say that some of the developments which have contributed to the success of the Highlands and Islands have come from other sources, but of course there's been a huge role played by HIE. I've acknowledged that 3 or 4 times now.
I cannot think that anybody in the Western Isles who's concerned about concentration of power in Inverness is going to be happy about it being further concentrated in Edinburgh. But I accept what you've said earlier about there'll still be a role for HIE. Can you clarify for me then what the difference is? We're still going to have the Chief Executive in Inverness. They're still going to have a board. What will be the difference? What will they not be allowed to do? Where would this overarching board, which is definitely going to happen, what would happen if there is a view within HIE that something X should happen? In what circumstances would the overarching board say you can't do that? And if it's only about partnership working, why do you need to create that authority over it in order for that partnership working to take place?
I think that last point is the key, because to be perfectly honest, as I've tried to be, we don't feel that's happened to the extent that it should have happened up to now, that joint working between different agencies. We think, whether it's in relation to internationalisation or in relation to skills, and the evidence that we'd cite for that is the fact that we've not achieved our ambition to move from the third quartile in terms of the OECD rankings to the first quartile. We haven't achieved that. Whether it's in terms of internationalisation, productivity, competitiveness. We've had an increase in productivity in Scotland of around 4 to 5% over the last 10 years, which is not nearly enough. The UK actually has stood still during that time, no increase at all, and yet they still have a higher productivity rate than we do, and most of our competitor countries have got a higher productivity rate than us. So we believe whether it's internationalising, whether it's scaling up companies, whether getting more investment in, we can do better. And we think the way to achieve that is to have a greater alignment between the agencies working. And that's what the Strategic Board is intended to do.
But aligning is not the same as overruling, which is clearly with the power that the centralised board would have.
We'll move on. Gillian? Followed by you.
Comes off the back of what we've just been discussing. The 5 actions that set out in the Phase 1 report, one of them is an open and international economy. And you mentioned very briefly at the start of the session about the Brexit decision. How much has the Brexit decision impacted on the change and creation of this new overarching board? How important now and how urgent is that now, given the challenges of the Brexit situation, not just for businesses in the economy, but for our universities?
I think it's extremely urgent, and I think it's explained not just by our approach to this review and the conclusion in terms of an overarching board, it's also by other decisions taken, for example, to double the number of SDI staff working across the EU and to substantially increase their activity, so the establishment of a board of trade. And it does come down as well to making sure that when we make these representations, we obviously are not in a position where we're allowed to strike trade deals, but we can do a great deal in terms of trade promotion. Now, if you're going to do that, the point I would make, which I'd sought to make earlier, is that we're best to do that in as organised a way as possible. So, for example, in the last week, the First Minister's announced substantial support for the Chambers of Commerce. That is about their international activities and about ensuring that whether it's ministers, whether it's universities, whether it's SDI, that we do that in as coordinated a way as possible so that we're having the maximum possible impact. Now, that's important to do in any event, but I think everybody can see how much more important and how immediate it is in terms of the Brexit background to what we're doing.
With regard to the economic impact that universities could potentially suffer by not being able to access EU funding, how much more important is the links with businesses and enterprise agencies that maybe hasn't been as strong as it could be? I know it's been very strong. Highlands and Islands Enterprise and Highlands and Islands University have got very, very strong links, but that hasn't really been quite across the board of whole Scotland, has it?
Well, this committee will have had the chance, I think, as been mentioned, to ask the agencies themselves. I think the agencies themselves would concede the point that you've made, that there should be greater collaboration to do. And there's no question that the university sector sees itself as, by some way, the most vulnerable in terms of the Brexit discussions. Within a week, in fact, of the results, I had a meeting with all the Chambers of Commerce in Scotland and was told by one of the representatives from the North East that they had already lost a contract within 1 week. It was an Erasmus-related contract. And you'll know the vulnerability that universities feel in relation to being able to draw in people from elsewhere is extremely important. So, yes, I think given that context and given the pressure of Brexit, especially in relation to the higher education sector, then that level of collaborative working, and I'm admitting here, I'm conceding the point that it's not been what it should be in the past. I think the agencies would concede that point, and this is a large part of what the review is about.
So really the success of Highlands and Islands Enterprise in that regard, there is an opportunity here with this overarching board to actually share that knowledge and that success so that we can actually take what has been very successful in that area and duplicate it across the whole of Scotland.
I think it's a very fair point, and one of the proposals which was made, I'm trying to think whether it was just made publicly or whether it was in the response, was actually that Highlands and Islands should take responsibility for the south of Scotland. That was a proposal made by a number of people. We didn't think that was right, which is why we didn't decide on that. But you're right to say, I think as Joanne Lamont has mentioned already as well, there's a huge amount within what HIE has done which has been seen by other areas to be something that is not universal across the board, but much of what they've done has been seen to be very positive, and other areas do believe they can learn from it. And that is, of course, if you're going to have greater alignment between these different agencies, now to be 5 agencies, everybody can learn more effectively if they're being in a situation where they're working together in a closer way than they have been in the past. I don't think anybody should I can't see what the nature of the opposition would be to that idea, that they should work more effectively together. So they should be more aware of what's going on in different agencies, so they're not cutting across each other, and also where there's good practice that can be shared across those different agencies. I think that's very important, and it hasn't happened. From the government's point of view, it's not happened to the extent we'd like to have seen it happen, and I think the agencies, by and large, would bear that out as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ross Greer.
Thanks, Convener. Going back to the Funding Council, Cabinet Secretary, what implications does the government expect there'll be from the abolition of the Funding Council's board on external funding, that from charitable organisations from Europe, etc.?
I maybe ask Paul Smart to come in this as well, but I think that will come down to what is determined in terms of the governance structure. I think it's one of the issues which is raised by Universities Scotland, and I think there's no interest in the Scottish Government in seeing a reduction in that funding beyond the threat that we already have from Brexit. So I think we're very keen to make sure that doesn't happen. There's also a related issue, which is the one of classification as well, where we have the situation where the ONS seems to take pretty much at its word whatever Eurostat says in terms of classification on these matters. So we do have to have regard to that as well. Another issue which has been raised by University Scotland, but the way in which these issues will be dealt with, and which University Scotland and the Funding Council, both the Chair and Chief Executive, being involved, is to make sure those concerns are reflected in how the governance arrangements are produced, and that will happen as a part of Phase 2.
Taking that on board, and sorry, Mr. Smart, were you looking to come in?
Just to add that already the Scottish Funding Council with the University of Scotland and the Scottish Government have a strategic funding group which is having to consider all the funding implications that you've referred to in terms of looking forward in terms of future funding packages for the universities. So that will continue to be the case going forward as well under the auspices of the Scottish Funding Council and the Scottish Government and University of Scotland.
Taking on board what you said, would one of the simplest things to do right now in terms of governance, this question already been covered, could we not rule out now that the board would be chaired by a minister? Because that would have pretty significant implications for research funding, for at least the perceived independence of the institutions. I've already picked up on concern that funding agreements coming up in the next few months are in jeopardy because of the perception that these institutions will end up not being separate enough from government.
Well, to the extent that's true, that's a requirement to get on and do this. I understand that point. But I think it's perfectly possible to see that, and given if you think about, probably unfair to mention about Alice Brown, and given her experience in public sector reform, I remember hearing her, I said this to her recently, lecturing on this in Brussels a number of years ago, and I went along to the lecture. We have some substantial expertise amongst the people that are looking at this issue just now. I think it's right that we let them do their work rather than announcing ad hoc different parts of this governance review. So I think I understand the point that you make about the need to get on and do this, but I think it's right that we should let those people take this forward in the meantime.
I think your point around classification was an important one. If you look at particularly funding from charitable foundations that are based in England, the Wellcome Trust, for example, when this issue came up in Ireland, they were giving universities in Ireland around half of the funding they otherwise usually would because of the classification as public bodies. This makes me question the entire process and the purpose of it, going back to the questions that have been asked previously about why we've even got this far, identifying what the need is in the first place. Are we not simply jeopardising the ability of our universities to get this funding, to solve a problem no one really seems to have identified?
Well, I think we have, for our part, believe we have identified a problem. We have to improve our economic performance. I think the evidence shows that we haven't achieved what we set out to achieve. That's not just this government. It has been true of previous governments as well. So I think we do have a need to do that. In any event, I do think there's a need, as I've said, for that increased alignment and collaboration to take place. But we are seized of the issue that you raise, as are the universities. They are intrinsically involved in this process, and it's not our intention to see a reduction for the reasons that you mentioned in terms of research or support for universities.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. And the last question is from Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, you've been talking about dangers of ONS reclassification. Clearly, it's not something that's desirable. I was looking at the joint submission by the NUS, UCU and University of Scotland, and they say that this the reclassification is under review at present, which is a little bit alarming. Is it actually under review at this point?
I think what they may be referring to is the major classification which happened in recent years was something called ISA 10, which is, as its title suggests, from 2010, even though it was 4 or 5 years after it had been developed, that the implications of it became clear. So because of Eurostat guidance, then the ONS started to look at ISA 10. I think what they may be referring to is are now further iterations of that classification, classification process. So without seeing it in front of me just now, I think that's what they're talking to. I do understand that, not least because of the response that there has been to ISA 10 being issued, and bear in mind, ISA 10, if it's developed in 2010 and we get told about it that we have to comply with this in 2015 when we're in the middle of doing, for example, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route, that we have to change its classification, public authorities around Europe can't cope with that kind of uncertainty. And I think there's been a substantial backlash to Eurostat, not least from in Belgium, some of the regional governments here who've had projects which have been cancelled because of that. There's been a substantial backlash. So I understand, and this is just my understanding, that Eurostat perhaps are now acting in a way that's more cognizant of the need of public authorities to be able to plan these things, which may mean that the process of further classification isn't as drastic or as ad hoc as it has been just now. But I think what's been referred to in that submission is the further iterations of that reclassification.
Okay. Just a couple of random items, because a great deal of what I've been asking, of course, has been already covered by my colleagues here. I understand that HIE has some sort of social element in terms of their remit. How will that be impacted?
Well, as I've said, we intend that HIE, and you're right, that was, going back to its formation many years ago, a vital part of what it's done. So, as again, if we say, if I rule something out or in just now, then it undermines the work of those that are taking forward the governance and remit structures for the new board and how it relates to the agencies. But that has been, without question, a very valuable part of what it's done. And it's been our intention to make sure that HIE, notwithstanding what we've said in relation to the boards, has the same structure that it has just now. It's got its own chief executive, it's got a legal status. So I think those things are going to be protected in relation to how we go forward from here.
Very much. Well, in that case, that's us finished our questioning, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Mr McAloon and Mr Smart. And I look forward to hearing you with the information that we requested. Thank you. That closes the public session.